In the previous lesson, we saw how to create the Antelope Reader and how to generate the factory in order to create an instance of the Antelope Reader and then expose the getAntelope collection through the facade. So here we have the facade. We have already the method implemented. Now let's work on the communication layer by creating a controller so as to show this data, the records that we're going to have in the Antelopes table on screen so that we know that the code that we wrote is up and running. And of course, for that, we're going to also use our Spryker. Let's go to the console, and you can see here that I have already ready this command that you can see here. Let me just clear up the screen. We have this command, add Z communication controller. Let's press enter to answer the questions that we need to answer to get our controller. So the first thing that we have to specify is the module where we want to insert this controller. And of course, the module is Antelope. Then the name of the controller, you can see here, controller. The controller, we're going to call it index. That's going to be the default controller for our page Antelope. Okay, now let's take a look at our folder, our main folder. You can see here that we have the business folder. As soon as PHP Storm updates the tree, you can see here the communication layer. So we have the communication layer that we could have created by hand, but thanks to this Spryker, we have the possibility to have the controller created by the command line. So the structure would be the communication folder, because we're inside the communication layer, then the folder controller where we're going to place all of our controllers. Then we can have index controller, for example, add controller, delete controller, etc. And here in the controller, you can see that if we expand the comments here, you can see that we have access to get factory, and it's gonna search for the Antelope communication factory that we don't have because we're not gonna use it. But we also have access to the Antelope facade interface. We could have also access to the repository from the controller, but it is better to go through the facade in order to have access to the persistence layer. So let's create a method called index. And if we want to expose that method through the router, then we have to add the postfix action to the method. So the method is going to be index action. And in this method, we're going to call the facade to read the antelopes. So first, we have to create, if you remember, in the facade, you can see here that we have to pass an antelope criteria transfer, okay? Even if we pass an empty object, we have to pass it. So let's go back to the controller. Let's create an instance of the antelope criteria transfer. And you can see that we don't need a factory in order to create the DTO. So DTOs and entities can be created inside methods. So now that we have this parameter, we can call, for example, let's create a local variable here called antelopes, and we're going to call this get facade, and automatically Spryker is going to locate the facade from the business layer. So we don't have to import the facade here in the communication controller because it is automatically located by Spryker. So we call the facade, and then we call the method getAntelope collection. And here we're going to have the antelopes. Of course, we have to verify if we have any antelopes. And the way we can call the antelopes is by calling the get antelopes from the getAntelope collection, because we have a collection with some methods. We can add antelope, etc., as we saw in the persistence layer. But with getAntelopes, we get an iterator with our antelopes. So how can we show this method? Of course, we could just output a JSON representation of these antelopes, but we can take advantage of this occasion and create a view just to show these antelopes here. So here we have the communication layer, business, persistence. We can just right click and create the folder presentation, and that's the naming convention. We have to use this name in order to show a view. Then inside the presentation layer, we have to create the name of the view with a folder. And in this case, we're talking about the index controller. So we have to create a folder called index, case sensitive. So it has to be the same name of the controller without the postfix controller, index. And that's it. And inside this folder, we create a template with the name of the method without the action postfix. So in this case, it would be index, and we use the templating system twig. Inside the index file, we open the twig tags, and we can extend the GUI template. So we call extends, and then we pass at GUI, and it's going to locate that template from the GUI folder from Z. You can see here we should have the GUI here. If you don't see it here, of course, you have to search for it in the vendor folder. Okay, and you can see here under vendor Spryker GUI, we can go to SRC, then Z, and then you can see here the presentation layer. And if you go to layout, you can see that we have layout here. So that's why we use at GUI, then layout / the name of the layout. In this case, we could use iframe layout or layout. In this case, we're going to use layout. So we're going to inherit from this template, and we're going to override the content block. So we start the block content, and then inside we're going to create our content block. So let's create a table in order to show some antelopes. Let's close also the block, and in here then we can output our content. We can open a table tag. Let's add some bootstrap classes that we already have available on the back office. In this case, we can add table, table, and table striped. Then we can add the t-head, and let's just add some field just to test that our code is working. So we can add the ID, the name, color, age, for example. And now we can open here the t-body, and inside this t-body tag, we can open the twig tag, and we can iterate the antelope. But before we can iterate the antelopes, we have to go back to the controller and pass the data to this view. So how can we do it? We can just return here this view response. You can see this view response, and then we can pass data to this view response. So in this case, we can pass an array. The key would be antelopes, and that's the key that the view is going to receive. And as value, we can pass antelopes. Now we would have these antelopes available inside the view. So we can iterate with a for loop for antelope in antelopes. Then let's close the for loop, and inside here we create a tr tag to show our data. So we have the ID of the antelope, the name, and then we can also add color, and then we can add. So in order to have some data, we can go to the tables that we already created, and we have to at least create an antelope location and an antelope type. You can see here, edit data, that I already added a location name called Savannah with latitude and longitude, and I already added also a type, for example, Springboks with ID antelope type 1. I also added some records here. You can see Impala, color brown, age 12, and all of them are going to be type 1 and location ID 1, just for testing purposes. So you can see here that we have the name Impala, Springbok, Gazelle. So let's give it a try, and let's see if our code works. So here I am in the back office, and in order to visit the antelope page, we have to pass here antelope, then the name of the controller, but due to the fact that the controller's name is index, we don't have to specify that name if the action that we're gonna call is index. So we can just enter, and you can see here the table. We have Impala, Springbok, Gazelle, and you can see here the color and the age. So we could also pass index as the controller and index as the method, but that's the default one, so we don't have to add it. If you add a new method and you want to map this method in the URL, then you have to add it to the URL. So as you can see, our method is working, and also all of the things that we wrote up until this moment, like the persistence layer, the repository that we wrote here, the method getAntelope collection, we have it from here, and then we expose this data, this method, through the Antelope Reader in the business folder. Okay, you can see here the reader, because the reader gets an instance of the repository. Why? Well, because we created an instance of that reader through the business factory, and you can see here that we inject the repository. By calling get repository here inside a factory, we automatically have access to the repository in the persistence layer. So the reader is going to receive the repository here, and then in this method of the reader, we can call repository, and then we can call the method. You can see here the footprint of that method by hovering the method here, get Antelope collection. And the facade here exposes that method. We could have used a different method, but this is the one that we use. And you can see here that we call get factory. We create an instance of the reader. The factory automatically passes the repository to the reader, and then we can call the get Antelope collection. After that, in the communication layer, we created the index controller. And when we have a controller, we automatically have access to the facade in the get facade method. Here we type hinted here with the method annotation so that we can have auto completion with our facade and not with the default facade that our facade inherits from. Okay, that's why we have this method annotation here so that we can have auto completion here, and you can see that it works. Okay, and then of course the rest is just passing the data to the view and showing that data in our presentation layer here. In Spryker, we have the possibility to create tables and forums, but this is just a quick way to show you that the code that we wrote is working. Okay, see you soon in our next lesson. Bye.